I've never told this to anyone out of respect for my friend Mike. It happened 20 years ago, but I think about it often. When I'm up late at night, my thoughts will drift away, and for a moment, I'm a carefree kid with no worries and a wild imagination. As an adult, there are all sorts of rational answers to what transpired, but I've never quite latched onto one as the answer. But even though there are a dozen possible answers to what happened to us as kids, it all started with a single question.
Have you seen the crawlers?
I was 10 years old at the time, and no, I hadn't seen the crawlers. I didn't know what my friend Mike was talking about. He shoved his hands in his pockets and shifted his weight from foot to foot. He was talking faster than usual. Mike was certainly excited to tell me and our friend, Tommy, about the crawlers. Whatever they were.
They're these creatures that only come out at night. And they don't come out all the time. If you see one, it will be slowly crawling through a yard, but only when it's really dark out. They don't want to be seen,
Mike insisted. It was a lazy summer afternoon, and we were just 3 kids wasting time on our bikes in a safe and relatively boring subdivision. Nothing should have creeped me out at that moment. But the term crawlers immediately gave me a case of the willies. The good kind of willies. The crawlers sounded creepy, and I loved anything creepy.
There's only 3 rules if you see a crawler,
Mike said.
Number 1, don't shine a light on a crawler. If you do, it will sneak into your house and kill you.
I nodded and smiled. Tommy just rolled his eyes and shook his head. I looked down on Mike as he told the story, but not in the lack of respect sort of way. It was a literal sort of way. I was 8 inches taller than Mike. The doctor said that Mike was in the 1st percentile for height or something like that, and he might only ever grow a few more inches in his entire life. Tommy's parents once told us that Mike liked to make up stories to compensate for the fact that he was done growing and was such a weakling. I found that kind of mean. Mike continued.
Number 2, if you go out to meet a crawler, you have to keep your eyes shut. Don't look at it. If you do, it will kill you and take over your life. It will mimic you.
He paused and thought about it for a second.
But I'm not sure about that one. I think that's what I heard, but it might be different. I can't remember the rule completely,
Mike said. I smiled wider. This was really great. Tommy looked increasingly irritated.
But the best rule of all is number 3,
Mike said.
If you go out in the middle of night to meet a crawler and you keep your eyes shut, the crawler will reward you for being so brave. Say a wish out loud and it will come true. That's the power of the crawler.
My mind immediately raced with the possibilities. I had never seen a crawler in my backyard, but I'd never looked that closely in the middle of the night before. Maybe there was something crawling through my yard when the moon was high and the world was asleep. My house did back up to a forest, and there were a bunch of trees and bushes in my yard. A crawler would probably be easy to miss. It could squirm across the property line from the forest and then disappear without me even realizing it.
I gotta go,
Mike said, hopping on his bike.
Don't tell anyone else about the crawlers. They don't like it if too many people know about them. I could get in trouble for telling you.
With that, Mike pedaled away on his bicycle. The black patented leather on his sneakers glistening in the sun, as his bike pedal spun faster. Tommy scoffed and rolled his eyes again.
I wish I was short. Then maybe my parents would buy me $100 shoes to make me feel better.
I ignored Tommy's comment. My head was too preoccupied with the existence of crawlers.
He's so full of crap.
Tommy said.
He's just playing a joke on you. Mike's never said anything smart in his whole life. You know, he's in those special slow classes, right? There's no such thing as crawlers. Don't listen to him.
But the thing was, I wanted to believe Mike. I wanted to believe in crawlers. So that night, I stayed up way later than I should have, just waiting at my window. I sat there with the lights off, just sipping on soda and trying hard to stay awake, gazing into my large backyard and out into the forest. I shone a flashlight on a comic book as I flipped through the pages, trying to keep my mind from slipping into sleep. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement from the edge of the woods. I clicked off my flashlight and dropped to my knees, my eyes barely peeking above the windowsill. I couldn't believe it. It was a crawler. I tried not to look directly at it because I was nervous that it'd be breaking the rules. I dropped down below the windowsill for a few seconds, and then slowly rose up, careful not to look too long. I carefully sneaked a look, but then my eyes dashed away. I didn't hold my gaze for longer than 2 seconds at a time. I didn't want to break one of Mike's rules. But the creature was there, dragging itself through my dewy yard near the very edge of the forest. Pale skin, skinny arms and legs, very deliberate and stiff movements, like it was struggling to move, all the while drenched in darkness. It was a crawler. At least, I think it was. It was impossibly dark outside. I thought I saw its head turn, and I quickly dropped down, worried it might see me. This time, I didn't get back up. I slept on the floor until sunup. The next day, I told Tommy about what I saw, and he laughed at me and shook his head.
You can't be serious,
he said.
I can't believe you're falling for this. It's just Mike playing a trick on you. I'll get to the bottom of this before you look even stupider.
I didn't listen to Tommy. I wanted crawlers to be real. The next night, I was determined to see the crawler again. I snuck outside at midnight with a sleeping bag under my arm. I wanted that crawler to come back, and this time, I wanted my wish. I unrolled my sleeping bag near the edge of the forest and climbed inside, shivering with a mix of fear and anticipation. No one would understand how I felt, I remember thinking. No one would be brave enough to do what I was doing. I was dying for something as fantastic as a crawler to actually exist. It'd be like my favorite kind of movie come to life. Crickets chirped, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed in the night. I laid in my sleeping bag under the stars for hours before I heard the noise. The rustling sound of a body being dragged across grass and dirt. I pinched my eyes shut and waited. The rustling came increasingly closer, and my eyes clamped shut even harder. The labored breath of whatever was inching closer grew louder. It must have been a few feet away when it stopped, and then I felt its hand gently rubbing my leg over the flannel sleeping bag. It stopped on my ankle and latched on tight. Its fingers felt unnaturally long, like they wrapped themselves twice around my skinny leg, I wanted to look. I yearned to see this horrible creature before me, yet my eyes did not betray me. They stayed closed, even as the breathing of the crawler turned into a growl. It was growing impatient. But then it dawned on me. I hadn't thought of my wish. In that moment, my mind blanked, and the grip on my leg tightened. I blurted out the first thing that popped into my head. A dog, I sputtered. I've always wanted a dog. I wish for a dog. The creature grunted and released the grip. My eyes burned with pain from the force of squeezing them shut. I listened closely as the rustling of the crawler's body slowly led into the forest, and the sounds vanished into the night. I jumped up, grabbed my sleeping bag, and hightailed it inside. The following morning, I was eating breakfast with my family when we heard a low whimper and scratching coming from the front door. It whined some more, and then it barked. I almost choked on my cereal. We opened the front door, and there sat an emaciated black Labrador. There was no collar, no form of identification. It dropped its head and looked at us with droopy eyes. Everyone immediately fell in love. I knew at that moment that we'd never find the owners. That dog would be ours. I finished breakfast and rode my bike like the wind to Tommy's house. I told him everything, but he was very disbelieving. He had that smug look on his face like he was just humoring me.
I hate to break it to you,
Tommy said,
but that was Mike outside your house last night. I got the whole scoop from his older sister. Their parents have been fighting a lot, yelling, throwing things, the whole deal. When Mike gets upset, he goes outside and crawls around the backyard. I guess he doesn't want to be around them, but he still wants to hear what they're saying to each other. So he'll crawl around the yard, get close to different windows and listen. His parents don't know that he does it. And sometimes,
Tommy continued,
Mike will crawl around the yard even when his parents aren't fighting. That's what his sister says. Pretty weird.
My heart broke that moment for Mike. That sounded awful. I couldn't imagine my parents fighting like that. Yet something still wasn't sitting right. What about the dog? I asked. How do you explain the dog? My wish came true. Tommy shrugged his shoulders.
Maybe it's a coincidence. Or maybe Mike found a dog and brought it to your house as part of the joke. But Mike is the crawler. He has to be.
Tommy made a good point. It made perfect sense that Mike was the crawler. I was ready to drop the entire situation, but I still wasn't entirely convinced. I needed to find out for sure. That night, I waited again. I lay in my sleeping bag near the forest's edge, hypnotized by the soundtrack of the night when the familiar rustling returned. I pinched my eyes shut yet again, ready to make another wish. This one would prove if the crawler was real or not. The crawler lurched on the ground towards me, and soon it was at my feet, gripping me with both hands this time. It pulled itself on top of me, dragging its body across mine. It breathed heavy and hard. Every movement it made was a colossal struggle. Its face was now inches from mine, and I felt its cold breath on my nose as it inhaled and exhaled, but my eyes remained shut. Its hands rubbed up and down my face, like a blind man searching another face for recognition. There was no blurting out from me on this night. I knew exactly what I'd be wishing for. I wish for my friend Mike's parents to stop fighting, I said. I wish for them not to yell at each other anymore. The creature gasped and rolled off of me. I felt it lying next to me. Its breath quickened and was intermixed with light sniffling. I know it's you, Mike, I said. And I do wish for your parents to stop fighting. You don't need to crawl around and spy on people anymore. I didn't look, but I felt the crawler roll up into a ball and cradle itself. I lay still, eyes always closed. I'm not sure how long we laid like that in the summer night. And eventually, even though I was paralyzed with a mix of sadness, apprehension, and utter terror, I fell asleep. I awoke to the sun rising. The crawler was gone. 3 days later, Mike announced to us that his parents were getting divorced. They were sick of fighting. They were tired of the screaming matches. They brought out the worst in each other, and it was time for them to split up. As Mike told us the story, he gave me a knowing look. A moment passed between us. A moment of recognition. Mike knew that I was aware of his parents' problems. And I gave him a reassuring glance and a tiny smile. Mike wouldn't be crawling around his yard anymore. His parents' fighting would finally be over. My wish had come true. None of us talked about the crawlers again. We were kids and we moved on to other things. And talking about the crawlers just felt wrong. I didn't want to dredge up Mike's unhappy memories about his parents fighting and divorce. That would be cruel. So I just let it go. But 3 years later, the crawler came back into my life one last time. If only for an evening. I was 13, and I was up late watching a movie at my house with Mike. He was asleep on the couch, and I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. I mindlessly gazed out the window and spotted something plodding on the ground near the edge of the forest. It couldn't be. I quickly turned away, hesitant to look directly at it. I thought hard about the rules of the crawler, but my mind was blank. What were they again? One popped into my head.
Don't shine a light on a crawler.
I switched off the kitchen light and I made sure the backyard light was off. Our black lab sidled up to me, nosing at my leg. I reached down and scratched its head, and my dog moaned in appreciation. Oh, what was another rule? It had been so long. My mind strained and Mike's words came back to me.
If you go out in the middle of night to meet a crawler and you keep your eyes shut, the crawler will reward you for being so brave. Say a wish out loud and it will come true.
I wasn't going out there this time. I didn't have any more wishes at the moment. My main wish had come true, and Mike was much happier once the shouting in his house had stopped. He had even shot up 7 inches in the past few years. He was no longer the shortest kid in our class. I glanced down at my dog, then back outside. I squinted hard and tried to make out the creature in the distance. I looked over at the couch, and Mike was still sleeping peacefully. But what was the third rule? I just couldn't recall. The crawler dragged itself methodically around the back of my yard, If the rules were true, I knew I shouldn't look closely at it. But I couldn't help myself. The crawler was as I remembered it. Skinny and disjointed. A shimmer from the moon caught my reflection. It was the shoes. Those expensive shoes with the patented shiny leather. They gleamed and glistened. I squinted harder, and the creature crawled directly into the moonlight. We made eye contact, and we held it for several seconds. The creature that stared back at me was Mike. I dropped down to the kitchen floor and I breathed in and out slowly. That crawler in my yard, it looked familiar, but it wasn't the Mike sleeping on my couch. It reminded me of 10-year-old Mike. Skinny, short, and weak Mike. He was even wearing Mike's special and expensive shoes. He was the only kid in school that ever had them. But Mike outgrew them 2 years ago when he defied the doctor's predictions and started growing like crazy. Mike tossed that pair of shoes in the garbage. They didn't fit, he said. They made his feet hurt. Something wasn't quite right. My head was spinning. What was the third rule? What did Mike say to me 3 years ago when we were only 10? I scanned my brain and fumbled through memories, and then it bubbled up to the surface.
If you go out to meet a crawler, you have to keep your eyes shut. Don't look at it. If you do, it will kill you and take over your life. It will mimic you.
I rose and peeked out the window. The patented leather flickered once more at the edge of my lawn, and little Mike carefully slithered along the forest's edge. And at that moment, I was convinced that crawlers were real. And maybe Mike had just screwed up the rules. He said 3 years ago that he wasn't sure about the mimic rule, didn't he? Perhaps Mike had gotten the details wrong. Maybe the crawler doesn't just kill you and then assume your life. Maybe it leaves you alive and makes a copy of you and assumes your life. And then maybe you become the crawler. I looked out that kitchen window again and I saw nothing. There was no movement, no plodding creature squirming near the forest. The crawler was gone. I returned to the living room, settled back into the recliner, and gazed at my friend. He slept peacefully, softly snoring. I shook my head, laughing at my foolishness. Maybe the 10-year-old me believed in the fantastic. The 13-year-old me didn't believe there were now 2 Mikes. One dozing on my couch and another living in some weird crawler limbo. That type of awesome creepiness just wasn't possible. There must have been a rational answer. But at that moment, I knew I would never mention it to anyone. The crawlers were just too sensitive of a subject. I would never say a word. I would never ask Mike to wade into his pool of hurtful memories. Because the Mike I remain friends with to this very day has too much going for him. By his senior year of high school, my friend Mike was the tallest kid in the class and the best athlete in school. That Mike graduated college with a physics degree, high honors, and a perfect girlfriend who later became his wife. The Mike I know has a mother that got remarried to a great guy, and I couldn't be happier for that Mike and his family. But my mind always returns to the crawlers. And that's why I still gaze out my window in the middle of the night, looking for the glimmer of those old shoes from 20 years ago. Looking for a 10-year-old lost in time. I sometimes wonder if my old friend Mike became a crawler. Poor, weak, 10-year-old Mike, with the arguing parents, expensive shoes, and fantastic tales. I know it's stupid, but I do it anyway. And when I do, I feel like an awful person. I feel like I'm admitting that the real Mike would have never amounted to anything. That the real Mike would have remained short and weak for the rest of his life. That the real Mike is now just a lost, helpless creature. I don't want to think these things. But I can't stop myself. And every time I do it, I think about Mike's rules for the crawlers. I remember clearly those 3 rules he told me and Tommy on that lazy summer afternoon all those years ago. Maybe Mike did get them wrong.